greetings everybody, and welcome to what is essentially going to be the starting point of our broad sweeping themes of history in the 20th century. Certainly there's a lot of things that are going on in Europe between 1900 and 1914, but much of what was dominating the geopolitical landscape at the time was this movement towards what would inevitably be war in 1914. Now, when we look at the causes of World War I, it's multi-layered and multifaceted. So what I hope to be able to do is to kind of break things down into small pieces and eventually connect those pieces in giving you an understanding of the complex dynamic that existed in Europe and the complex forces that existed. Because, as I said, there was many layers that were contributing to the cause of World War I. From this, of course, we will continue into the war itself, and then look at themes like the Russian Revolution, the Weimar Republic, and Spanish Civil War, and many others during that really fascinating interwar period from 1918 to 1939. So lots of really good topics coming up, and much of the things that occur in the pre-World War I period, and of course the period directly after, really sets the tone for much of the 20th century rather, and even to some degree circumstances we find ourselves in the 21st century were predetermined by events in this time frame. So wanted to just look at a couple of pictures here. Of course, we're going to talk quite a bit about this fellow here, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. Here's some pictures of looks like a king, maybe a British king, imperialism. Here's some of the symbolism of the helmet and a pickle groove. I don't think there's a pickle groove on this helmet, but the little pointy thing was called a pickle groove, and that was strictly ceremonial. It goes back to the days of Prussia before the unification of Germany. And this is a very important painting, which I had the privilege of seeing in Berlin in all its glory. It's a massive landscape, this painting. But this is where the new German Empire would proclaim its empire in 1871. And no, this was not in Berlin. This was in occupied Paris, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. And if that sounds familiar, it certainly does, certainly when we get to the end of World War I, but we're going to talk about why this event is so important when it comes to not only where the Treaty of Versailles was signed, but the punitive nature of this treaty, where that stems from, and it goes beyond just World War I as well. So, all right, well, let's look at Europe in 1900. Now, I want to be clear right off the bat that we are going to be focusing on the five main players in Europe at this time, and by no means do we mean to disrespect Belgium or Luxembourg or Holland or any others, but I wanted to really focus on the nations that were in a major position to set the tone and to offset the equilibrium of this balance of power that existed in Europe at the time. So we're going to be focusing on the great powers, and you can see this map here, of course. You might be familiar with this. Here we have, of course, Great Britain. We have France. We have the new Imperial Germany. That's a big country. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the dual monarchy was also referred to. And of course, to the far east, we have the Great Russian Empire, which probably extends well past the view of your screen right now. So those are the big five that we're going to be focusing on. So as I said, the great powers were mainly comprised of Great Britain, France, Republican France, Tsarist Russia, Imperial Germany, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also of course known as Austria-Hungary. So those are the five key players that we're going to be looking at as we lead up to the events that contribute to the causes of, or that lead to the breakout, if you will, of World War I. In a very general sense, and the details of which we're going to get into thoroughly, the war was caused by long-standing rivalries between them, which were worsened by a series of events between 1905 and 1913, culminating in the immediate cause that sparked the war, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. He was the heir to the Austrian throne. Okay, so that's kind of the broad, sweeping spectrum with which we're going to be looking at in this lecture. So let's look at some of the long-term causes. All right, well, cause number one, and we're going to look at several. Colonial rivalry or imperialism. The word colonialism is used interchangeably with the word imperialism. They essentially mean the same thing. The competition for colonies was intensified by 1900 when Germany, under the Kaiser Wilhelm II, decided that Germany also deserved a place in the sun. A place in the sun was basically the Kaiser's way of saying, hey, you guys have been taking over all parts of the world for decades, if not centuries. We deserve a piece of this pie too. So imperialism by its very nature is extremely arrogant. It suggests, and I want to be clear that all the European colonial powers were beset with this kind of superiority complex. So we are a powerful nation, we are the most civilized nation, it is within our right to head overseas and take over regions of the world that easily fall to us. You have to consider that when the Europeans were spreading their wings, if you will, overseas into Africa, Asia, and the South Pacific and everywhere else, you know, what was the one thing that separated Europeans from the peoples around the world? Was gunpowder. So if you could roll in your ships and blow off a couple of cannons, you could scare the heck out of indigenous peoples around the world. The other tragedy of colonialism, and this goes way back to the days of Columbus and John Cabot and Jacques Cartier and many others, is that indigenous peoples around the world unfortunately falsely thought these Europeans were gods, and it made them that much more easy to overcome and to take over because they worshipped them initially. And when you look at the experience of the conquistadors and the Aztecs, that tragedy there. So basically, you know, imperialism is powerful nations going overseas and taking over nations that were easy to overtake, you know. The interesting thing is that, for example, if we use Great Britain as an example, what did British people think of the British Empire during the Victorian period, let's say? Let's say the height of the empire, really sort of the 1870s to the pre-World War I period, 1914. What was it that British subjects understood about empire? Well, they understood that it was a moral responsibility. It was a religious crusade to bring Christian civilization to the darkest corners of the globe. That in fact, we were doing these people a tremendous favor. It was the white man's burden, to use a term from Rudyard Kipling's brilliant poem. It was the burden and responsibility of Europeans to civilize all corners of the globe. So for public consumption, British subjects, and the same could be said certainly for the Germans and the French and other colonial powers, this was a noble act to bring civilization to four corners of the globe. And you could argue that this colonial mentality, of course, you could draw all sorts of parallels. And in the case of Canada, when you look at the phenomenon of the residential schools, that was an extension of this colonial mentality. The more they're like us, the better off they will be. The more we remove their local or indigenous culture and language and teach them English and put them in a top hat and a cane, the better off they will be. So, you know, colonialism by its very nature is not only crass because it's about conquest, but it's arrogant to suggest that we Europeans are better and therefore we have every right to take countries over. You know, there's many complex layers to the imperial mentality, but really if you look at sort of the justification, we begin to see early signs of what later would become Nazism, you know. And when you look at something like social Darwinism, you know, pitting certain races against others, some are better than others, and therefore it's our right to take them over. That in fact Nazism stems from this imperial colonial mentality and social Darwinist thinking of the late 19th century. Now, I am not comparing, of course, the imperial powers of the late 19th century to Nazism. What I'm suggesting is that those attitudes towards indigenous peoples around the world or people of other cultures becomes in its most extreme and hateful form in the rise of Nazism. But we'll come back and look at Nazism another time. So what happens by the 1880s is, you know, Britain and France have carved up a significant portion of the world under the yoke of their colonial apparatus. And of course the British used to gloat that the sun never sets on the British Empire, that you know, and India of course would be the crown jewel of the British Empire. And the French were really hunkered down in North Africa, in Indochina were the two main ones, and other places as well. But what happens with Germany is because they get into this race late, they get into it at a time where Britain and France had finally kind of found a place where they could somewhat respect each other's territory. But when Germany gets into this race, particularly in the scramble for Africa, it really throws the British and French off, because they're thinking, wait a second here, who do you think you are coming down here and setting up shop next to me? And you know, the aggressive nature of German imperialism, because they were late bloomers, really exacerbates, of course, tensions at home. So therefore imperialism is an important cause of the outbreak of World War I. Increasing pressure from working class political movements in rapidly industrializing Europe. This cause, I believe, is overlooked. And I want to give you an example. So what's happening in Europe, particularly in Great Britain and France, or rather Great Britain and Imperial Germany were leading the way in terms of industrial advancement, in terms of rapid building of railway systems and so forth. I mean, everybody else would eventually catch up, but really was Germany and Great Britain. Out of this rapid industrialization, as we see a growing proletarianization of the cities, that is the birth and expansion of this new class, the working class. And out of this, of course, rapid growth of a working class stems the birth of Marxism, which we've talked about in previous lectures. The rise of socialist, communist philosophy and thinking. We see communist and socialist parties, blossoming as well. And the reason I think this is important is because the expansion of radical political thought in Europe is creating a lot of tension amongst European powers who are saying, oh my gosh, we got these radical parties, you know, how do we take the heat off? Well, how you take the heat off is you provide them things that make their lives better. You give them cheap resources and cheap products that you can provide to them that are a result of the fact that you're exploiting third world nations around the world. So there was a real sense that, and Otto von Bismarck, we'll talk about later, was the master of this, of understanding that to take the heat off the revolutionary nature of left-wing socialist communist parties, provide them the things that they claim they want. An eight-hour workday, a minimum wage, old age pension, whatever it may be, those kinds of things that we need to alleviate the pressure of revolutionary activity by making the standard of living better for working class people. And in many ways I would argue that the birth and rise of militant Marxism in the 19th century did a great service to humanizing Western governments by forcing them to make the decision to treat their citizens better, or else they're going to be overthrown by revolution. So anyway, an important part. Next we have accelerated militarism brought on by the industrial advancements and continental fear and insecurity. It's like a vicious cycle. Europe is industrializing at a rapid rate. They're colonizing at a rapid rate. There's this growing tension in Europe as a result of this growing working class radicalized group of young workers. And as a result of rapid industrialization, we also now, Europeans have the technological ability to mass produce armaments. And the best way to protect yourself from your neighbor who could potentially be your enemy is to have an arsenal in your warehouses at the ready should war break out. So we see this rapid acceleration of militarization occurring throughout many of the European countries at the time. Then you have another factor. So once again, just to revisit, you've got imperialism, you've got pressures of working class parties in Europe, you have accelerated militarization as a result of rapid industrial advancements, and in addition to that, you have this hornet's nest of Europe, as it's called, the Balkans. Balkan nationalism. The Balkans were kind of landlocked right in between the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the north and the Ottomans in the south. The Balkans were once part of the Ottoman Empire. The Balkans still are, inhabited by largely Slavic people who sought independence. And, we'll come back and talk about this, but what makes the Balkans so complicated is you have such a diversity of ethnic groups. You have Croatians, you have Serbians, you have Romanians, Albanians, Macedonians, and they're not necessarily all living in one distinct geographical area. They're all kind of spread out and mixed in together. So when you talk about Balkan nationalism and you say Serbian nationalism would be the obvious one when we look at the causes of the war, how do you create nations out of these ethnic groups if they're all mixed in together, right? That was a fundamental problem when we looked at the partition of India in 1947, because you had Muslims, you had Hindus, all mixed in together. Well, which one's going to be the Hindu nation and which one's going to be the Muslim nation? Similar set of circumstances, and we're going to come back and look at how that dynamic of all these ethnic groups desiring autonomy, and particularly the Serbians, and why that became sort of a powder keg in the Balkan area. Many of these Slavs were also part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire who feared the loss of their territories to nationalism. A couple things we need to put in context. Tsarist Russia and the Austro-Hungarian were extremely ethnically diverse. Great Britain was predominantly British. You have the Welsh, the Scottish, you have the Irish, you have the English. They're all English speaking, many of them, they're all coming from the same historical background, give or take a few variances of course. Germany, same thing. Yes, the Rhinelanders are very different than Prussians, and the Saxons are different than the Bavarians, but at the end of the day they all speak Russian, or rather German, sorry, and they all share the same religious history, whether it be Protestant or Lutheran, a form of Protestantism, or Catholic and so forth. So in many ways, nationalism in Germany and Britain, and France for that matter, could be very much a unifying force, because you're bringing together all these people that have so many shared commonalities. But when you talk about nationalism in the Balkans, then you're talking about pulling things apart. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because you have to consider we're dealing with Austrians and Hungarians and Czechs and Poles and Hungary, and the list goes on and on and on, that once people begin to think in terms of ethnic connectedness, and they don't want to be part. Why would the Serbians want to be part of a kingdom in Austria who speak German? A lot of people in the Balkans would say, well, I can't even identify with my king. He doesn't speak the same language. He comes from a completely different place. Let's do our own thing. So nationalism is a very destabilizing force for the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a result. This region became a powder keg between Russia, Serbia's protector, and Austria-Hungary. See, Russia began to see itself as the Slavic, proclaiming Slavic leadership in the region. Because the Serbs, for example, were Slavic peoples, they would say, look, we'll stand by you guys. and the Austro-Hungarians are saying, wait a second here, don't get in the way of our internal affairs. So really the Balkans becomes a bit of a struggle, if you will, between the interests of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Imperial Russia as well. So, all right, the arms race, and this is an extension of vast industrial advancement in Western Europe. So massive industrial development had led to these main powers amassing large armed forces, and conscription or mandatory service was common. So you have large armies at their beck and call, you have this mechanization of industry, which is now pumping out so many guns and ships and weapons and helmets and so on and so forth, just stockpiling, waiting. Guns, shells, bullets, other weapons had been stockpiled, resulting in a snowball effect of nations competing for military supremacy. Mass weapons and armies increased confidence and later pressure to prove their mettle. Well, this is the one fundamental problem with having an economy that is built around massive industrial development that is geared towards a military framework. I just asked the Nazis, my gosh, between 33 and 39. Their whole economic advancements and reemployment and everything that they did economically was geared towards rearmament. And unfortunately, in those circumstances, the bubble will burst. And once economies begin to recede or go into recession, then usually in these cases, war breaks out. So, the Anglo-German naval race between Germany and Britain further exacerbated Britain's insecurity. Their dependence on the Navy for empire and defense made them fear German competition. This was one of the great mistakes, I think, of Imperial Germany, is they should have laid off on this. But when we talk more about the Kaiser's personality, we'll explain why this happened. But the Navy was always central to the sense of security of Great Britain because they were a vast imperial nation. They needed the ships to control and maintain the control of their imperial network, but they also needed a strong Navy for defense because they are an island nation. So the moment you start competing with Great Britain, particularly in the case of Germany that's so close, and you say, well, we're going to build ships too, then you're creating a lot of instability and you're antagonizing the British in many ways. And unfortunately, the Kaiser was very good, unfortunately, at creating these kinds of tensions. So, all right. So the launch of the German dreadnought in 1906 created a naval race and soured any relationship between the two. So the Germans are really focused on one-upping the British. Well, we want ships too, and so on and so forth. So that really sours a relationship between the two. All right, there he is. What a fascinating character. And here we go. There's this picture again, 1871 of German unification in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. So he is seen as the main figure in fanning the flames of war with his bellicose and aggressive foreign policy. I mean, I don't really think that any one person can be held accountable for the causes of World War I, but I would argue that if there is one person that is more responsible than any other, I would argue that the Kaiser unfortunately takes the award on this one. A lot of it is built around his personality, and I think almost talking about his personality almost requires another lecture in itself, but I will basically summarize some of the main things. Here he was born, in a very strong Prussian military background. He was born with his arm was severely damaged in birth, and he wasn't able to use it. And I think it was his left arm. And when he was a young boy, he was taught that you're going to be the king, and you've got to be strong, and you've got to be proud, and you have to be able to ride a horse. And he suffered many, many punishing experiences of, sitting on a horse and then falling down because his balance was always off because of his arm. And, so he went through grueling, almost torturous, repetitive drills, if you will, to overcome this disability. And as a result of growing up with this sense of insecurity, combined with this tremendous expectation that you are going to be the Prussian king, and later, of course, the German king, it creates a very interesting dynamic in the Kaiser himself. He really, I believe that a lot of his bombast, his medals and his big hats and his pointing, he had this sort of bellicose, sort of get in your face, point, shout, I want kind of personality. And he had this tendency to really repel people because he was overwhelming. He had a very, very strong victim complex. But this public posturing was very contradictory to his personal life. Now, his personal life is interesting because his hobbies were interesting. And you'll be surprised to learn that he enjoyed, in his spare time when no one was around, flower arranging. He made dresses. The majority of his social circle outside of his leadership position were a group of gay men. And later, many of his ministers would say, you've got to disassociate with these guys. It doesn't look good. He himself wasn't gay. He just, I think, found in his relationship with these men his ability just to kind of relax and not be a tough guy all the time. So you've got this really interesting dynamic. Now, when he becomes king, Kaiser in 1888, he is desperate to get the respect that he deserves, and he's going to run this show, and I alone rule Germany, he used to say. And you have to consider that the king, the Kaiser, always had someone whose responsibility it was to manage foreign and domestic policy. Now, before the Kaiser II, you had Otto von Bismarck, and we'll come to Bismarck another time. But he was the preeminent foreign policy guy. He was the chancellor, and he was a remarkable diplomat. He was able to forge a variety of complex relationships with his European neighbors to maintain peace. Because when Germany becomes unified in 1871, which is 17 years before the Kaiser becomes king, Bismarck once said that Germany had now reached its practical size, its largest practical size. Every effort must be taken to maintain peace and stability. And everything that Bismarck did in terms of his foreign policy was built around that idea of maintaining peace and stability. So this network of relationships that Bismarck had forged comes to a screeching halt when this young, bombastic, mercurial, if you will, Kaiser comes in. He's 29 years old, and he says, you know what, Otto, I'm running the show now. Thanks for your service. In 1890, 2 years later, Bismarck is dismissed. I think he was getting very, very near the end of his career anyway. But when the Kaiser gets rid of Bismarck as the chancellor, that's where things begin to get very difficult, because the Kaiser did not have the diplomatic prowess that Bismarck had. A lot of diplomacy is not about what you get done, it's about how you relate to people. How do you get people to do what you want them to do? Diplomatic skill is wrapped around interpersonal skill, knowing how to make people feel like they're getting something when in fact you're getting the better end of the deal, right? That is the magic touch of diplomacy. And Bismarck had that, you know. Bismarck also said of the 5 major European powers, always be on the side of 3. It's that simple. Always be on the side of 3, and in 1914 Germany was on the side of 2. So a lot of interesting things going on. But so that's sort of the backstory of the Kaiser. So Germany had a long tradition of militarism going back to the days of Prussia before unification in 1871. You know, in many ways, the military sort of stereotype you have of Germany, the helmets, the pickelgrube, the waxy mustaches, that really is an extension of Prussian history. That if you go to Bavaria or you go to the Rhineland or even up north into Schleswig-Holstein, these are very, very different cultural places. Even though they speak the same language, the dialect though is so different. I mean, Berliners have a hard time understanding people from Kiel or Lübeck, and they're only 6 hours away, give or take, by car. So, you know, there was definitely a strong strain of Prussian militarism that really projected this sort of stereotypical view that we have of Germany as a whole. So, with Russia modernizing and France feeling vengeful for their defeat in 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War, we'll talk about that next, many German commanders were convinced war was inevitable. Coming back to this portrait, and once again I'll do my best to be brief. In 1870, in the final stages of German unification, Germany goes to war with France. Prussia, it's called the Franco-Prussian War because it was still Prussia. This war was instigated by Germany because Bismarck, who was chancellor at that point, knew that he could rope the other German states in southern Germany to be part of this greater Germany, to say, hey, look, we're going to go to war with France. We don't know what they're going to do, but we can be your great protector. You need to join us. We need to come together as a single nation. And of course, they go to war with France. The Prussians do. They unite the majority of German-speaking areas that had held out in the first phase of unification in 1867 and in 1866-67. And when the Prussians defeat the French in 1870, they then occupy Paris. And while they're in Paris is when they finally have pulled in all these other areas of Germany that were not part of its union. And they said, now's the time for us to declare our new empire. And hey, while we're in Paris, let's just do it here. We got this beautiful building, Versailles is a beautiful building. We're going to do it in the Hall of Mirrors in Paris. So think about this from a French perspective. France has just been defeated by Prussia, humiliatingly defeated. Paris was occupied by the Prussian army. And the Germans, the Prussians, now the Germans, as a collective whole, have the audacity of declaring their new German imperial empire in the most sacred of French architectural structures in the Palace of Versailles. So think about that for a minute. Think about the audacity of the Germans to do this. But think about the incredible anger and resentment that puts in the French people. So that day, that the occupation of Paris after the Franco-Prussian War, that stuck with France right through till the end of World War I, which is why it was so important for Georges Clemenceau, the French leader in 1919, to have the Treaty of Versailles signed in the very place where Germany declared its empire in 1871. So, by 1905, the Schlieffen Plan was devised to defeat France quickly by invading through Belgium and then dealing with Russia. The one thing that Bismarck did while he had alliances with Austria and Hungary and Russia and Germany, he was always trying to kind of isolate France, because I don't think France would have been interested in having some kind of friendship pact with Germany. The anger and hatred bubbled between these two countries, and especially, you know, the region in between these two countries, Alsace and Lorraine, the two French provinces, which are now in France. But for years they went back and forth between French control and German control. So, all right, and here's a picture of the Schlieffen Plan. You know, I'll be perfectly honest, the Schlieffen Plan is not anything brilliant. I think that what makes the 1905 Schlieffen Plan important was the fact that in 1905 German policymakers were devising strategy for the defeat of France and Russia, well before there was any talk about war. You know, So I think that's what makes the Schlieffen Plan more important, was the fact that German policymakers were having these conversations and devising these strategies. But basically what it suggested is we're going to invade through Belgium. We're going to sweep around. You can see here, take Paris, and then boom, shoot around and continue over to Russia. Because the assumption was by 1905 that if they're going to war with France, they're going to go to war with Russia. So it was going to have to be quick, and it was going to have to be lightning speed and across. But unfortunately, when 1914 happens, as you may know, the Belgian campaign really slowed down Germany. So the Schlieffen Plan didn't really work the way it was expected to. So, all right, let's look now a little bit more into the details of Bismarck. I know we've talked about him, but I wanted to talk about some of the alliance systems that existed. And the way Europe was carved, the way Europe related to each other in terms of these alliance systems was really born out of the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Congress of Vienna of 1815, which were those treaties and negotiations that ended the Napoleonic era. You know, the understanding was that if you had kind of two solid blocks, you know, keeping each other in check, there'd be a balance sort of power, right? The balance of power is, you know, but the problem with the balance of power, of course, is the idea that the moment one of those nations goes to war with another, then everybody gets dragged in because they're all connected, which is why the word collective security comes in after World War I with the League of Nations. That, of course, is very contrary to the balance of power type of diplomacy. So, here we are. By 1907, Europe was divided into two rival camps. As I just said, a dispute between two would result in war between all of them. This system started in 1871 with Otto von Bismarck and was continued until 1890 when he was forced into retirement by Wilhelm II, who wanted to guide foreign policy more directly. Here's Bismarck here with his pickle group. As I said, this is strictly ceremonial, and I must tell you, just as a footnote, when I was a kid, I'd see the pickle group helmet. I thought that it was sort of like a last resort weapon. So you're in the trenches or something, and you've lost your rifle, and the enemy's coming. You can hold the side of your helmet, put your head down, and run as fast as you can at the enemy, which is of course ridiculous. But that's what I thought they were for as a kid. 1871, Bismarck believed Germany, as we said, had reached its practical size, and now peace and stability was paramount. You know, so in many ways, when there are and I don't see the comparing too often, but I've heard comparisons between Hitler always liked to compare himself to Bismarck, the great diplomat, but they were nothing alike. I mean, Bismarck was shrewd. He was the Iron Chancellor, yes, but he wasn't a bloodthirsty murderer. He was more a practical pragmatist than anything. I mean, well, maybe pragmatism might be a bit too soft. We practiced real politics, the hard facts of what you need to do to ensure the stability of your nation. So, after the final stage of Confederation in 1871, or unification as they say, Germany had reached its largest size. The problem was that his system from 1871 to 1888, that 17-year period, Bismarck was the guy. And he's the one forging all these complex labyrinthine alliances throughout Europe. But it was the ascension of the nationalistic and pugilistic Wilhelm II, and I say William here in 1888, which threatened future stability. If one individual would shape events toward war more than any other, as we said earlier, it would be Wilhelm II. Just as another footnote, Wilhelm was also directly linked, you have to consider this too, that the monarchs of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, and the King of England, George V, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Tsar Nicholas II were all first cousins, right? They were all related. They had the same grandmother, Queen Victoria. And you know, when Kaiser Wilhelm was a young boy, he loved to go visit his English cousins as a child anyway. His attitude towards the English changes. But as a young boy, he used to go and travel, and he marveled as a young boy at the ships of the British Navy, and he'd ask his grandmother, I want to go see the ships. And, you know, he used to say as a young boy, when I grow up, I want to have ships like this. And of course his grandmother would say, no you don't. In fact, Queen Victoria had a pretty negative view of him even as a boy. She said that he was unruly, he was rude, and that he needed to be spanked more frequently. That's what Queen Victoria said about her grandson, Wilhelm. So, you know, the writing was on the wall at a very young age that here was a kid who was destined to be as crass and as arrogant as he later would become. The other thing that's interesting about the Kaiser is he was really very, very uncomfortable being around people who were comfortable with themselves. So, for example, his uncle, Edward, who replaced Queen Victoria, correct? Oh, I have to get my monarchy lineage in order. I believe it was Edward from 1901 to 1913. Edward was kind of gregarious. He loved to have a good time. He loved to party and make people laugh. You got to consider he was a constitutional monarch, so he didn't have the pressure of leading in the same way that Tsar Nicholas did, or even the Kaiser. But you know, the Kaiser really didn't like his uncle, and I think what he didn't like about him was he saw in his uncle qualities that he was not capable of having, that he didn't have. And the tragedy of the Kaiser is there were times in his journals when he even would recognize his inability to achieve the kind of social skills that someone like Edward could, but he never did anything about it. He never tried. He seemed to lack the ability to understand that interpersonal skills and how you relate to people is going to do you wonders in terms of getting things that you want. So very, very interesting stuff. Okay, let's move on to Morocco. So 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale. This gave France a free hand in Morocco with British approval to complete her empire in the north. So the Entente Cordiale is a huge turning point because Britain and France had been enemies for hundreds of years. I mean, you look at the colonial wars in North America. You look at all the struggles with throughout the world for the previous 200 years had finally sort of begun to come to a rest. And in fact, the colonial rivalry and the general rivalry of Britain and France go back to the 100 Years' War. So I mean, there had been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of conflict that are now about to shift because of their mutual concern about the behavior coming out of the Kaiser's government. All countries were concerned about this new Germany in 1871 because it was this monolith in the center of Europe, and they were used to all these fractured little Germanics, some 360 autonomous principalities. And there was never much of a concern there, but now it is this monolith, and it really begins to mess with the equilibrium in Europe. And in addition to that, the fact that the Kaiser was so bellicose and pugilistic, for lack of a better term, created a lot of problems. So they're now friends. Britain says, hey, France, you got free hand in Morocco, everything's good. The Kaiser's watching this, and of course, he's annoyed because he's like, why the heck are the French and the British, friends? And the tragedy, of course, is that the Kaiser could have charted a much more positive relationship with the British, but unfortunately his behavior got in the way. He wanted to test the new alliance by supporting Moroccan independence. He hoped Britain would not back France. So he went to Tangiers, which is the capital of Morocco, to support Moroccan independence, sparking off a crisis which led to an international meeting, which led to the French getting a free hand in Morocco. So get this, I'll clarify this. The Kaiser goes down to Tangiers to support Moroccan independence, hoping to put a fissure between Britain and France and pull them apart, when everybody in Europe looked at it and went, what on earth are you doing? And when he gets to Tangiers, he has to ride a horse, that is not broken into him. This was very interesting because, of course, because of his disability with his left arm, and by the way, you'll notice that in video footage or pictures of him, his arm is always kind of resting like this. And I don't know if you can see, stand up like this. Usually his elbow is sort of sitting on the butt of a sword, and it's kind of resting. He's always got a glove on. So the horses he rode had to be broken in specifically to his disability. So when he's riding this horse in Tangiers, there's people standing around. Here's a picture, there he is here. There's usually someone directly behind him ready to catch him in case he slipped and fell off. So he makes this procession into Tangiers, and unfortunately the rest of Europe shakes their head and says, this is ridiculous, you don't give a hoot about Moroccan independence, and what it does is this just solidifies the alliance between Britain and France. Only Austria-Hungary supported the Kaiser, which became a profound embarrassment to him while solidifying the Entente Cordiale. Now you've got Britain, France, and Russia. And what was it Bismarck said? On the side of 5 major players, always be on the side of 3. So things were moving in a bad direction. In 1907, Britain concluded an agreement much like the Entente Cordiale, this time with Russia. So once Britain and Russia become firm friends, feelers had been sent out for quite some time anyway, before this, but now you've got those 3 are united in a single alliance. The Triple Entente of Britain, Russia, and France were allied against the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and an unreliable Italy, because they were always kind of waffling. In fact, they waffle in 1914. They don't quite know what to do, who to side with. So, well, by 1908, nationalism was destroying the Ottoman Empire in Europe and threatening to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I failed to mention, of course, that the Ottoman Empire was equally as ethnically diverse as the Tsarist Empire in Russia and the Austro-Hungarian. So nationalism is kind of tearing these 3 major empires apart. In the Balkans, Serbia led the way by becoming openly hostile to Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. So Serbia is becoming the loudest and most vocal opponent against Austria, against the Ottomans. They want their own thing. Serbia was independent, but wanted to annex Bosnia, where many Serbs lived. Austria-Hungary occupied Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, inflaming both the Serbs and the Russians. Okay, this confuses a lot of people, so I want to make this really clear. Serbia was an independent state, but within, and it bordered on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a province, I'll call it, called Bosnia. And within Bosnia was, the majority of people there were Serbs. So if you were a Bosnian Serb, you're looking over the border at Serbia with a great deal of envy, and you want to be part of that. You can identify with an independent Serbian nation more than you can your Austrian monarch. So Bosnia becomes a real problem because the Austro-Hungarians do not want to let go of Bosnia, but the Bosnian Serbs don't want to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Serbia sought support from their Slavic neighbors in Russia, who were careful not to antagonize both the Austrians and the Ottomans. It was becoming clear why the Balkans was center stage. Bismarck was correct. This is very interesting. Another thing that makes Bismarck a remarkable leader, in 1888, when he was still Chancellor of Germany, that was the year that, of course, Kaiser Wilhelm came into power, he said this: "The great European war will come out of some damned foolish thing in the Balkans." Now, if that's not prophetic, I don't know what is. He understood 30 years before the outbreak of World War I that when and if war comes, it's going to come from somebody making a stupid mistake in the Balkans. So there you have it. After 2 Balkan wars from 12 to 13, nationalism had finally destroyed the Ottoman Empire, which had been in retreat for decades, if not centuries, which empowered and elated the Balkan nationalists and dismayed the leaders of multinational Austria-Hungary. The stage was set for 1914 because ethnic loyalty was challenging dynastic power. So the forces of nationalism were destroying the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the irony is that the more unstable the Austrians felt, the more they felt the need to clamp down. Like it was almost the opposite thing that they should do, you know, but that was part of that insecurity. And I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had had problems for generations as a result of nationalism, but it was really coming to the front rather in 1914. All right, so the heir to the Austrian throne, meaning the next king to be, was the nephew of the current monarch, Franz Joseph, who in 1914 had been in power for, oh gosh, since 1867, if not, I mean, for a long, long time. He's assassinated in Sarajevo, which at the time is part of Bosnia, with the aid of Serbian nationalists. Okay. Sarajevo was technically within the boundaries of the Austro-Hungarian Empire because the province of Serbia was there. So what the Archduke does is he says, let's go extend an olive branch to these uppity Bosnian Serbs by saying, hey, we're your monarch, we love you, we don't want you to go anywhere, I'm going to prove my good faith and come for a visit. And a lot of people in his entourage in the Austrian-Hungarian government said, do not go to Sarajevo. You are a sitting duck. You cannot, someone will knock you off. You must wear bulletproof vests. You and your wife. And he refused. I'm not going to wear a bulletproof vest. I don't need such a thing. I don't want such a thing. I'm going to extend an olive branch to my Bosnian Serb brothers. Well, when the assassination occurs, outrage in Europe occurs, but Austria was slow to respond to Serbia, which it was determined to invade. Germany, now it's interesting, Germany was not part of the initial process here. Germany pledges to support Austria, and Russia, building up its military, was likely to defend Serbia while drawing in France. Now before we continue, I wanted to talk briefly about the events of the assassination, because what's interesting is there was an assassination attempt on him before he was killed. And he demanded to go to City Hall and register a complaint, which I think he did. And he and his wife got back in the car. And they were convinced to take a different route than the main drag in Sarajevo. And what's interesting is as they do this sort of loop-de-loop route, they end up bumping into a fellow, Gavril Princip, who is heading to the main street to assassinate the Archduke. And there he is walking up the street, heading towards the main street. And he sees this entourage go by. He's like, oh my gosh, what are they doing here? He pulls out his gun, pow, 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 and he kills them both. So, you know, the fact that they took this other route may have been a major factor as to how they were so effectively assassinated. But so, Austria-Hungary blames Serbia, and it's not unreasonable to suggest they were part of it. When Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia says, wait a second, you can't do that, they're our Slavic brothers. We're going to mobilize. When Russia mobilized, Germany went, whoa, 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 wait a second, you can't mobilize, right? And so that's kind of how the whole thing rolls out. You know, because Britain, France, and Russia were on the same page, as soon as Russia mobilizes, then that makes Germany feel concerned about Britain and France to their left flank. Okay, here's a series of events. Austria mobilized, and what mobilization means is that you're demonstrating evidence to your neighbor that there are troop movements and tents and preparations. So Austria mobilizes. As a result, Russia mobilizes. Because of Russian mobilization, Germany declares war on Russia. And you can only imagine how difficult this would have been for the Kaiser, because his first cousin, Tsar Nicholas, and him were quite close. But nonetheless, and on the next day, Germany declared war on France. Then, at this point, Britain's hoping to stay out of this. Germany invades Belgium as part of their Schlieffen Plan strategy, drawing Britain into the war. And Germany invaded France, and then Britain declared war on Germany. Okay, it's like a domino, basically. Hope that doesn't confuse you. What's interesting with Belgium is that Britain had signed a neutrality pact with Belgium in 1839, I believe it was, guaranteeing their neutrality. So basically, when Germany invaded Belgium as part of their sweeping Schlieffen Plan motion, Great Britain felt they had no choice but to declare war, because they were there to defend the honor and neutrality of Belgium. So all of a sudden, what starts in a regional conflict in the Balkans explodes into a massive war. And you have to consider a couple of things. We had not had a continental war of this nature in Europe since 1815. Since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. There was nobody alive who remembered the Napoleonic Wars. And the European powers go into this war with a 19th century mentality, but now they've got 20th century technology. And this is why the Great War, or World War I, becomes so tragic. So next time, we are going to do our first part of a series on World War I. And I know it's a narrative often told, but I hope to have the opportunity to share some insights with you maybe that you had never heard. And once again, if you have any questions or any comments, you're always welcome to make any comments on YouTube. I'm happy to reply. And I want to thank you again for continuing. I will continue to load my lectures, and they may not necessarily come in order on my YouTube channel, because I'm sort of doing them in a variety of times based on what I'm teaching in my classes. But either way, I do appreciate you coming, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.